Study Box.
Duyamıyoruz.
Nazan, your mic is off.
Oh, sorry. Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Fiction and Reality, a talk with Neşe, Yaşın on creative writing. My name is Nazan, and I will be serving as our moderator today. And in this webinar, you will be hearing a speech from Neşe Yaşın about the process of writing, and also we will have some discussions on the topic. Now, I would like to introduce our presenter, Mrs. Neşe, who is a well-known Turkish Cypriot poet and writer. She is also teaching language and literature at the University of Cyprus. She has published 9 volumes of poetry, a novel, and a research book. Additionally, her poetry has been translated to more than 30 languages and published in several countries. Also, I would like to introduce our lecturer, Mrs. Sajwan Nerman Fatah, who is teaching various literary courses and also several courses in linguistics at Charma University and Nearest University. Before we begin, this webinar is organized with the help of eStudy Box, so please click on the link below and register to the website of eStudy Box, especially if you want to receive a certificate for attending this webinar. Apart from that, if you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to type it into the chat box, and we will have a look at them when it comes to this question and answer session. All right, without any further ado, I would like to leave the word to our speaker, Mrs. Neşe, and our lecturer, Mrs. Sajwan.
Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be in this live chat. I want to start with my personal experience in writing. I started very lucky because I come from a poet family. Actually, my father is a poet, and my brother and me, we are poets and writers. So from my early childhood, I was part of a house that I could call a poetic house, that my father was writing poetry. He liked to read poetry aloud, not only his poetry, but other poets' poetry. And my father also had a bookshop, so I had access to a lot of books. And because of his bookshop in Nicosia, he had to travel to Istanbul to get books for the bookshop. And sometimes he was taking me with him, and we would go to Baba Ali, Cağaloğlu, where all the printing houses were there at those days. And I was meeting other poets, writers. So for me, becoming a poet was not a decision, was not a choice. It was like a fate. It came so naturally from my very early childhood years. I was writing things like poems that I was imitating my father, and I was the daughter of the poet. So in my education, I was the one who was chosen to read poems or go to the radio and read my poems in those days in Bayrak radio. And by the way, my first copyright came from the Bayrak radio in those days, and they paid me 5 shillings for my first appearance in a program. I had to read the part of the Duck Mother in a children's play, and they paid my first copyright there. I was an elementary school student, I think the 3rd grade. So later, my first poems were published in a serious literary magazine when I was a university student in Ankara. I was a university student of Middle East Technical University, and it happened like this. There was the lecture, a talk of a poet, Ataol Behramoğlu, in Ankara Sanat Evi. And I went there to listen to him and get a book signed. And I wrote my poems in a notebook. In those days, we didn't have computers, just maybe typewriters, but I wrote with my handwriting in a notebook and with my address on it. And the address was very interesting. The 7th dormitory, Middle East Technical University, room number 2006, something like that. I was a university student staying in the dormitory. And I gave him the notebook. And after 1 week, I saw a letter from him from the pigeonhole of my in the dormitory. And he was writing that he really liked my poems and he wants me to send more, and also a biography. And he is planning to publish in the magazine that he was the editor of. This was the Sanat Emeği magazine. And finally, I was very excited. You can imagine, as candidates for young writers, young poets, how excited you get to be published in a serious literary magazine. I ran to the bookshop, was so excited I'll have one poem of mine there. But it was not one poem. It was almost all of them, 9 pages with an introduction of a discovery of a talented poet. So this was a very nice beginning. And then there was a lot of interest on my poetry. One publisher called me, wrote to me to have a book. So it was a very, very lucky start. Later, my brother started also publishing in the same magazine. He also met them, and we wrote an article of our, which could be considered as the manifesto of our generation in Turkish Cypriot poetry. And we were criticizing everybody before us, all the other poets, and especially our father. We really criticized our father because he put his poetry in the service of nationalism in the 60s because of what was being lived in Cyprus. And we were critical of this part, although he was a very talented young poet, appearing in magazines in Turkey and having very good critics in those days. So he was very angry with us as well, and he wrote an article in a magazine that he had a column in this magazine saying some young chinks, they are hiding behind their famous surname and criticizing everybody to get attention. So we had this kind of conflict with the father, but later he really understood our point, and he sort of wrote a poem that we published in the magazine we started publishing as the magazine of our generation. He was apologetic. So what I can say is that the most important thing I saw when I first started was that I had already established the atmosphere of my poetry. I mean, even if I didn't write my name under my poetry, it was very easy to say this is Neşe Yaşın. So this happened. I didn't have any effort about this. This happened just like that. Maybe because I was reading a lot of poetry. Poetry was for me the most important thing. Was a kind of existential thing for me. So, and I had lived tragic things. I had lived two wars in Cyprus. So there was a tragedy behind my poetry. So because of the tragedy behind the poetry, and also because there was a challenge. I was challenging my father's poetry. So I was against this. My father's poetry was heroic, but I had this very feminine and childlike approach. So it was a kind of a shifting of the paradigm he had. And my father was writing about the conflict in Cyprus. I was also writing about the conflict in Cyprus. But my father his poetry was part of the culture of conflict. He was there was this paradigm in Turkish Cypriot poetry, Turkey being the motherland and Cyprus being the baby land. And the baby land was in trouble because of the enemies, and the motherland was gonna come and save this baby land. So this paradigm was there. So in my poetry, I shifted this paradigm. For me, the motherland was Cyprus, and so I didn't. The enemies the enemy was war and militarism and nationalism, and not the other community. And I had empathy for the sufferings of the other community as well. So in those days, now when I say it, it looks very natural, and it looks like this is not marginal at all. But in those days, it was very marginal. It needed a kind of a courage to do this. So, but it had also a lot of dangers. Writing about the conflict, writing about a tragedy coming from a very minor community, which the center of the Turkish literature, Turkish language was Istanbul, and we were in Cyprus many years. The Turkish Cypriot poets wanted to get a confirmation from the literary circles in Turkey, in Istanbul. And they did never talk about an independent Turkish Cypriot literature. And they never claimed about this. They thought they were part of this literature, just writing from the periphery and being part of this literature. Because we had a challenge, our generation. Our challenge was that our motherland is Cyprus. We are different. We have a different culture. We have a different identity. So we are part of a Turkish language literature, but we are not part of the literature of Turkey. Because in Turkey they have another public space. They have another kind of history, collective memory. So this was making our poetry different. So there is an anecdote that I would like to tell, which will show how you know, as I said before, I managed to establish my own atmosphere in my poetry. The Turkish poet Cahit Kilebi was a very close friend of my father, and he wrote a letter to my father after reading my poems in this magazine that I mentioned, Sanat Emeği magazine. And in his letter, he was saying that he took the magazine and he was looking at the magazine from the back. And he started reading these poems, my poems, but he didn't see my name, because my name was on the first page. He was just reading these poems, and he thought, how lovely translations they make. So he thought my poems were translated poems. Although they were in Turkish, he thought they were translated poems because they were coming from another kind of identity, collective memory, another country geographically, another history. So this was very, this was not like expressed there, but behind the poems, they were there. So this is another point I want to tell. A poet should know many, many things. Like you should know philosophy. It's good to know sociology, even physics, multidisciplinary. You have to have knowledge. I mean, I wouldn't say you have to know, but it's good that a poet is really, really cultured and informed. At least in my experience, I think this is something that helps for good poetry. But these things should be in the background. You shouldn't. You don't show it in like if you write an article, you can put your knowledge about the different disciplines or something. But in poetry, this stays in the background of the poetry. Poetry is something very condensed and is another type of language. You know, if you're an academician, this may and you want to are very much you know, in this academic language, this cannot be in poetry, but your academic knowledge is very precious for your poetry, but this has to stay in the background. Let's say you know about mythology, but sometimes you don't mention about a mythological character, but through your verses, the reader feels that it is a reference to it. For example, in my poem, I'm talking about the woman who is holding the thread. This is Ariadne, but the name of Ariadne does not pass in this poem. You know, sometimes it can pass, but sometimes, you know, when you create an image, you can get help from these kind of mythological or in my poems, fairy tales are very important, and there are a lot of references to fairy tales, but you know that it is this fairy tale, but sometimes the character may be also mentioned, but just like that, it's like when you read the poem, you just it's another reality, but in the background, you know that there is. You remember this poem. It's like when you write like 3-4 verses, and sometimes these 3-4 verses, they multiply so much in the mind of the reader, and this is the magic of poetry. You write 2 lines and it says more than a book, more than an article sometimes. Such a condensed way of expressing things. So another thing I can talk about the novel I wrote. I just wrote 1 novel, and writing this novel was a very nice experience for me. I enjoyed the process of writing it. And in this novel, I constructed this 1001 tales, like a Shehrazad, telling about the recent history of Cyprus, talking to a man, a woman like Shehrazad, talking to Shehryar, which is never mentioned in the novel. But this was behind it. Behind, I thought, I can create this. I can have a Shehrazad and I can have a Shehryar, and Shehrazad can share the stories of Turkish Cypriots. A Turkish Cypriot Shehrazad can share the stories of a Greek Cypriot to a Greek Cypriot Shehryar in the style of 1001 Tales. And then there was a parallel narration, their story, the love story between the two, and their story through their bodies, through their relationship. I was making a political analogy for Cyprus not being united. So these things, when I was writing that, actually, I never thought about them. It's like I didn't plan to make a political analogy. It came so automatically. And I realized this is a political analogy, and many readers told me this, that there was a political analogy there. It was just maybe my intuition, the way I wanted to relate the story to the readers. Should I continue, or we can make a break if you have questions, and if you can, if you need another direction?
We can ask some questions and then continue if you want.
Yes.
So, Mrs. Sajman, do you have any questions at the moment?
Okay, so hi everyone. I would like to thank you, Nazan, for the nice introduction, and I would like to thank Ms. Neşe for having this very nice talk with us. It's a pleasure for us, actually. Well, Ms. Neşe, I want to begin with saying that, you know, we always write. Most of us write, especially when we want to talk ourselves. But instead of talking to ourselves, actually, we want to do that on a piece of paper. We do write, because, you know, it's the only place in which we talk very freely and genuinely. So there must be always an inspiration for that. So when you write, what is your inspiration apart from the nationalism? When you decide to write a poem or a novel, is there anything that happens at that time, or you just do this naturally? Is there anything specific thing that happens before you decide writing?
Okay, I'll tell you that actually I live my everyday as a poet. Like when I wake up, I read poetry, I translate poetry, so I follow literary magazines. But when my writing is like, there is a period that I write very intensely. Like I may write 5-6 poems in 3 days, and then I may have a very long break where and there I have no inspiration. I wouldn't say inspiration. It's like there is a point that I can't stop. I have to write. And this is what you have said, actually. We have our inner voice that we talk to ourselves. And then you want to put this inner voice on a paper. But it's also like dreams. We have these very personal things like dreams. So dreams are actually full of images. So for me, when I start writing, this is not a kind of a memoir kind of writing. It's a very complicated process. Very interesting images appear, and I don't know even where they come from. It's a very divine kind of, I would say, movement, something like magic. Like and I hear these things inside me. It's like these things that are so complicated. Actually, they appear as a sort of images. I write these kind of poems, but sometimes, because I don't write all the time, I just take notes. Not they don't become poems, but I have these notebooks that I write. Something comes in mind, and I write them, and these kind of things. Then when, for example, when I was writing my last book, Karikusu, Karikusu is sort of like a libretto, actually. All the poems, they are connected with each other, and they revolve around the same kind of a story, and they are like a contemporary fairy tale telling. The poems, because there was a story behind. There was something that hurt me was there, a personal kind of tragedy, let's say, and this thing was flowing out of me, and they were multiplying. So it was like in these poems, there were these 3 characters. It was like let's say a love triangle thing, because 3 is always magical for poetry, and for literature also love triangles are very, very strong. The other and these kind of things, the 2 other, or the other, and you are the other as the poet. This is also very important, that you become another to yourself as well, and look at yourself from the eyes of the other. So in these poems, I tried to. I was going to narrate something that I experienced, and I thought every narration is wrong. Is I wouldn't say wrong, but has trouble with the narration. Let's say not wrong, but has trouble with narration, because you have a selective memory. You choose you choose some things, you exclude some things, and because you are starring in the narration, you are the good one, and the others are the bad ones. You are the victim, the others are the perpetrators. These kind of problems I see in narrations. So in order to avoid this, I created this fairy tale atmosphere, and this atmosphere helped me to be more just to the other characters of the story. and in these poems there is one line, I'll try to translate it. Farklıdır masalın kötü kişisi, değişince masalı anlatan. The evil one in the fairy tale changes when the narrator changes, kind of thing. So this was the way. I don't know how much I answered your question, but I jumped here gradually.
Thank you very much. It's very clear. Well, the other question is that as a lecturer that I have been teaching literature for years, we know that the subject of women became one of the major issues, okay, in social problems, especially in literature. So how would you depict women in your writings? Would you be surrealist or would you be realistic?
Depict woman, you said?
Yes.
Yes, woman. Okay. So in my writing, okay, this is part of my identities. We have multiple identities, you know, and being a woman is part of my identity. I would say surrealistic and realistic, they combine in my poetry. They combine in a way. I think this is a kind of the atmosphere I create. This is the uniqueness that I go. They are both there, surrealist and realist. They exchange places. They help each other to approach the reality, and because I am a woman, and in my generation, it was very difficult to be. It was even more difficult to be a woman during the youth of my own generation. So it is there in my poetry, especially the last book is also actually my book Kapılar is very much my struggle and my rebel for this gender role. And in my last book, I have the surrealist and realist elements. And it is the small tragedies of being a woman. They are in my poetry. You can see them in all my poetry. So it's not a kind of a feminist militantism or anything for me. It's just there. I mean, if I write an article about women literature, I may put other ideas, but in my writing, as I said, it's background of my writing. Background of my writing is feministic, I would say.
Thank you very much. I will leave my other questions to Nazan and Yaren. Yes, go ahead and ask your questions.
Okay, Aaron,
first of all, yeah, I'm going to. First of all, thank you so much for this amazing speech, and thank you for being here. I have a questions to ask you about. What are your suggestions for those who wants to become a writer? Like, what can you give advice to us?
Okay. First, there is this anecdote I'll tell you about a young candidate for a poet asks for the master poet and says, "Master, I want to be a good poet. What can I do?" And the master says, "First, go and memorize 100 poems." And he goes and memorizes 100 poems, the candidate poet, and comes to the master and says, "I memorized 100 poets. Now what should I do?" And the master says, "Now forget all about them." So what I tell you is that you have to read a lot, but then not forget, but put them in the background and create your own unique atmosphere. Okay, this is very important. And to create a unique atmosphere, you have to be very genuine to yourself. You're about your life, because you have a unique life. You have a unique personality in this world. And this will make you a unique poet. To be very genuine with yourself and to find the real experience you have in your life. For me, the real experience was a child experiencing war and being a refugee, and this was it. So it was there, but it was also being a woman. It was living in an island, being in a small community, living in a culture of conflict, and also the family problems. What I experience in the family, in my very, very personal life, what I experience in my marriage, in my relationships. They are very important because they are unique. This is the only story I know it is real. This is the only story that I know, because other narrations that come that I hear I cannot really understand their details fully, but I know my own story fully. So this is very important. But my own story, my personal story, actually is the story of other people as well. Like sometimes I write something and another woman comes and tells me, I thought it was me talking. I was talking. You made me talk in this poem. So this is the magic of it. You tell your own experience, but it's also somebody else's experience, especially the way it is expressed in poetry. It's like a letter you write to your reader, but the reader reads it and says, this is very much me. This is very much my view of the world, my understanding of existing in this world, my experience of a relationship. This is also my childhood. So this is the magic of it. So you have to be genuine and don't fear about being courageous about yourself, because poetry is bringing the private to the public. And every kind of writing, you bring the private into the public. And this is very feminist, as you know, because personal is also political, and also there is this dichotomy between the private and the public, and we have to challenge this dichotomy. So poetry, any kind of literary writing, I think could do this. I mean, you can write something very fantastic, a kind of a fantasy, a kind of an utopia, but still you are there. Everything is autobiographical. Every writing is autobiographical, but maybe it's behind the writing, but it's there, it's autobiographical. Okay, other questions?
Thank you for the answer, Mrs. Neşe. Actually, I have a question. As a secret writer, did you face any obstacles during your journey as a writer and poet? Like, I mean, because, you know, Cyprus is not known and like everything is so hard sometimes. So did you face any obstacles?
Yes, there were, of course, obstacles coming from a very small community, claiming that this community has a literature or establishing its own literature, and then my books are published in Turkey, and for a wider audience. And there is this look at the, you come from the periphery, like yavru vatan, they say, yavru edebiyat, the baby literature. And so there are a lot of kind of prejudices, I would say. On the other hand, because it's not the only identity, also like my kind of political identity, then you have a lot of problem with the authorities that they don't like your ideas, and especially for poetry, I have a problem with the publishing of my books in other countries. I am only published in Greece, and I have a book in English, which was published in Cyprus, actually, the English one, unfortunately. But at least I have a book in English. And the problem is that the publishing houses, poetry publishing houses around the world, they are sort of spoiled by the funds, because every country has funds to subsidize poetry books, which does not sell much and which is commercially not profitable for publishing houses. There are a lot of funds. And for my books, or my novel, my poetry books, many publishers in Europe, they apply for funds, but they never get it. They apply for Turkey because they're published in Turkey. They don't get it because of several reasons, political. And when they want to apply, let's say, the Republic of Cyprus, the funds only apply for books that are written in Greek. And for the Turkish Cypriot side of the, there are no established SHIM fund for this, but in spite of this, okay, there might be for some funding from the ministries, but I am the persona non grata in some way. And so there is this problem. But it's a problem that could be overcome. I have already books ready, translated books ready in Hebrew, in Bulgarian, in German. The books are ready to be published, and the publishers, they want funds because they always get funds, which is not unfortunate. It's like this. But I hope that these books will come out very soon. We'll find kind of overcome this problem. So this is part of being part of a divided country, being in a country that the authorities are part of the conflict culture, but you are an advocate for a peace culture, and this a lot of things. But okay, I have a publisher in Turkey, very good publisher. And so I have a lot of contacts with very nice people, very nice with the literary circles. So these are advantages. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, of course. But like, let's say, as a beginner, as a like young poet, how can we publish a
yes,
work?
I'll tell you. First, you have to enter in magazines. Literary magazines. Gradually, you will start publishing. You will start appearing in magazine. You can start with the small ones, more provincial ones, but good ones with good editors. So you will start approaching them, sending your poems, write them letters, send your poems. Some magazines even have. Some magazines, they answer and they can tell you there is this problem with your poetry, please try to improve it in this. There's some, but first, this is the first step. Start appearing in magazines. Then start contacting like an elder person, an elder poet, a more established poet or writer, and have advices, start going to literary events that happen, start be present there and be try to, it will also help you to improve, but it will also help you to be in contact and people to know that you want to be a poet. We have to know that somebody is really willing to be a poet and writer. And we see, maybe we don't like the work, but we can say, if you really want it, try to improve it. And so this will help. Yes.
Thank you, Neşe. Mr. Sajwan, I think you might have other questions.
Actually, I had only those questions, but there is something on my mind I want to ask Ms. Neşe. There are topics like or concepts or ideas that you want to highlight it in your works besides the nationalism or women. Is there any kind of social conflicts that you see, for example, that you want to show it in your piece of writings, even indirectly?
Yes. Let me tell you something. My poetry is not on nationalism or women, actually. My poetry, my poetry is on the human experience, and everything is there. Every social issue, every personal issue, philosophical problems, existential problems. They are there because poetry gives you this this opportunity that, for example, I write a poem on loneliness. I'll give you an example of this. I had written a poem which was on loneliness, and then a young reader told me, "Oh, Neşe, what a lovely poem you wrote about Cyprus." And I was shocked. There was no Cyprus in this poem. It was a poem on loneliness. But in this poem, there was these lines. Şükrana adanmış kuzu, incecik ağlaması, müzikli kutuda balerin özgürleşince dönerim. The lamp was adamak. What was adamak is, let's say, it's like when you cut a lamb as a sacrifice. The lamb sacrificed for gratitude, and has crying with a thin voice. And I'm the ballerina in the music box. And when the lid is open, I start revolving. So this was very personal, very much for loneliness. But this young reader thought it was written for Cyprus. And then when I started thinking about it, I saw that Cyprus might be imaged as a sheep, a small sheep for sacrifice. And Shukran actually is a kind of an ideology in the northern part of Cyprus, the ones that have gratitude for the rescuer, for Turkey, Shukran. And and also freedom is also personal freedom, but it also something social, something political. So this is the magic of poetry. My poetry, I would say, my poetry is about everything about being a human being. And when Bachmann says, fascism starts between the two persons. So in my poems, I write about love all the time. I write about the relationship of two, but many social issues, many things you can get out of these very personal things.
Yeah, exactly. This is why that tells us every understand is misunderstanding. And I believe this is the problem with readers. Like, especially for reading poetry, they always think that there's something related to their ideology. That's why I always tell my students, go to the, you know, the very connotations with the meanings of the words, because reading poetry is not easy. There are so many symbols and signs you have to decode them and to see the meanings behind them. So these are all the questions that I have. Thank you very much for being with us today. It was a pleasure for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. But we have lost 10 minutes, and I have 2 questions from our audience. Firstly, Mr. Kazım asks, how to overcome dilemma of not finding an appointment word to express a thought?
To not finding an appointment with a established poet writer.
Can you please explain what you meant by the questions? Because
I think when I was saying that you have to get in contact with an established poet writer, so you can, yes, this is a problem. You can get some. I mean, okay, people doesn't have time. One is this, and there may be a lot of demand, but it's also opportunities should be created for this. I mean, there are also these workshops that you can be part of the workshop of a poet or writer, writing workshops. You can register to one of these, or you can just go to a reading, book signing, and just have a contact. And if you're really, really serious about your writing, if you really want to be a writer and a poet, then there is a way. You will find a way. So I mean, okay, many poets and writers say that there are some people writing to them, but they cannot really find the time. But the time could be created. Like you know, there may be these meetings with candidates, poet candidates, writer candidates to have, you know, some workshops are the best, I think, and also this kind of some literary events that you can go and meet the poet and writer.
Yeah, and also we have one more question from Ecem. She asks, other than her own work, which poet or author does she like to read?
So this is very difficult for me to answer, because really I can never decide on my favorites. But I would say the Iranian poet Furu is a, you know, very, very, very precious for me. And I translate a lot of poetry, actually. You know, during the pandemic, I started my day. Every day I translated a poem, and I continued afterwards. I mean, recently, since 2 weeks, I stopped it because I'm very, very busy with many conferences and other issues. But I'll start it again. But in my childhood, my first discovery was Nazım Hikmet as a like 14, 15 years old. But later, of course, I started knowing a lot of poets from world literature, and also poets in Turkey that I also met them personally. So I would say try to read many poets, you know. Every poet is a different world. Every poet is beautiful, precious in many different ways.
Yes, exactly. We have lost 5 minutes, and actually I want to ask you something. This was a question by me and Yaren. But can you just answer it briefly, because we have just last 5 minutes. So we read that you have been criticized for one of the works you have done, the novel "The Secret Cry of."
And this the secret history of little girls. Sorry, Üzgün Kızların Gizli Tarihi. The secret history of sad girls.
Yeah, our question is that how should we react to such criticisms as a poet?
I mean, this criticism was a campaign, a kind of lynch by some nationalistic and I would say sexist circles. And for me, when you have such a kind of a lynch, you need solidarity. So I wrote a letter. In those days, there was these Yahoo groups. And I had a column in Bir Gün newspaper in Turkey, a daily newspaper in Turkey. So I wrote this letter, which was distributed in the Yahoo groups. I wrote an article in my column. And then many people owned this, and they started sending me solidarity messages, and they started a campaign, and the TÜYAP Book Fair gave a special booth for the book, and the choir of women read the book during the book fair as a choir. You know, they were sitting in a circle and reading the book as a choir. So when you have such a thing, ask for solidarity. That's the only thing you can do.
Yeah.
And be strong.
Okay. Thanks for
if it was a criticism, like you can have this was not a criticism of the work. You know, this was just a campaign to destroy somebody. You know, it was kind of a lynch, like what Peru experienced once. You know, Peru had experienced because of an erotic poem in Iran. She had experienced this thing. Just get the support of others. That's the only thing you can do.
Thank you, Mrs. Neşe.
Thank you very much. It was very lovely. This feminine energy here as well.
So finally, we came to the end of our webinar. So I would like to thank our speaker, Mrs. Neşe, for the last one time. And I would also like to thank Mrs. Sajwan for coming up with this idea of organizing such an event for us. Also, I want to thank eStudyBox for helping us organize this wonderful webinar. And last but not least, I would like to thank the audience for their participation and attendance. So I hope this webinar was beneficial for everyone. That's all.
Thank you.
eStudyBox